If your dog has ever stared at you in complete silence without blinking for just a few seconds, there's a very high chance you misunderstood what was actually happening in that moment, because that fixed, almost uncomfortable gaze is not random behavior, and it is definitely not meaningless. It may actually reveal something much deeper about how your dog perceives you, reads the environment, and processes emotions in real time. And what makes this even more interesting is that the exact same stare can mean completely different things depending on the context, ranging from a silent request for attention to a deeper form of emotional connection that most owners completely miss because they expect dogs to communicate like humans, when in reality their entire communication system works on an entirely different level. Now think about this for a second. What if that moment when your dog is simply watching you in silence is not about you being observed at all, but instead about your dog trying to communicate something that cannot be expressed through any other behavior in that exact situation? Because modern canine behavior science already shows that direct eye contact is one of the richest forms of social communication between dogs and humans, and ignoring it can mean missing subtle but important signals about emotional states, needs, and even how your dog categorizes you within its social bond structure. And this is exactly where most people get it wrong, because they assume a dog staring is just curiosity, or sometimes affection without depth, when in reality this behavior can carry multiple layers of meaning that only become clear when you understand the context behind it. And in this video, you are going to understand exactly what that stare really means in different situations, and why the context completely changes everything you think you know about dog behavior. When we talk about a dog staring at its owner, we are not dealing with a simple visual habit. We are dealing with a deeply rooted communication system that has evolved over thousands of years of domestication, where dogs gradually learn to read human behavior, human emotions, and human intention through extremely subtle cues, and the eyes became one of the most powerful tools in that process. Unlike humans, dogs do not rely on complex verbal language, so their communication is built around posture, movement, timing, and especially gaze direction, which acts as a kind of emotional scanner that helps them interpret what is happening around them and how they should respond to it in real time. In many cases, a dog's direct eye contact is not about dominance or challenge, as some outdated interpretations suggest, but rather about information gathering, emotional synchronization, and social bonding, meaning the dog is actively trying to understand the state of its environment and, most importantly, the state of its human. This is why you often notice your dog staring at you during quiet moments, during routine activities, or even when nothing obvious seems to be happening, because from the dog's perspective, you are the central reference point of its social world, and observing you is a way to predict what comes next and how it should emotionally position itself. But here is where things start to become more nuanced, because the meaning behind that stare is never fixed, and it always depends on context, emotional state, and learned experience, which means the same behavior can carry completely different messages depending on the situation. And once you understand this foundation, the next step is to break down what that stare actually means when it comes from emotional connection, rather than simple observation. One of the most misunderstood moments in dog behavior happens when a dog looks at its owner in complete silence, with a calm body, relaxed ears, and a soft gaze, because in this situation, the stare is not about asking for anything, and it is not about scanning the environment. It is actually part of a deep emotional bonding process that strengthens the relationship between dog and human over time. When dogs share this kind of eye contact with their owners, there is often a subtle biological response happening on both sides, including the release of hormones associated with attachment and trust, which is one of the reasons why these quiet staring moments can feel strangely comforting even if nothing is being said or done externally. This type of gaze is often described in canine behavior research as a form of social synchronization, where the dog is not just observing you, but emotionally aligning with you, picking up on your tone, your posture, your energy, and creating a sense of shared state that reinforces the bond between both of you. In everyday life, this can happen when you are resting on the couch, when you are working quietly, or even when you are simply existing in the same space without direct interaction, and the dog chooses to look at you not because it needs something, but because being visually connected to you feels stable, familiar, and emotionally rewarding. However, this is also where many owners misinterpret the situation, because they expect constant action behind every behavior, when in reality, a calm stare can sometimes be the strongest sign of emotional security a dog can show, especially in environments where it feels safe and connected. And as we move forward, the meaning of that same stare changes completely when the dog is no longer seeking emotional connection, but instead trying to obtain something specific from you. If you are enjoying understanding what your dog is really communicating beyond the obvious behaviors, consider subscribing, because the more you learn about these subtle signals, the easier it becomes to build a deeper and more accurate relationship with your dog in everyday life, without relying on guesswork or assumptions that often lead to misunderstanding. Not every long, silent stare from a dog is emotional bonding or passive observation, because in many real-life situations, that same direct eye contact is actually a deliberate form of communication designed to get a response from you, and this is where the behavior becomes much more intentional and goal-oriented. When a dog stares at you in a way that feels slightly more persistent, sometimes paired with small shifts in body position, subtle movements toward objects, or repeated glances between you and something else, what you are often seeing is a learned communication strategy, where the dog has discovered that eye contact is one of the fastest ways to influence human behavior. This can happen around feeding times when the dog wants food or snacks, but it can also appear when it wants to go outside, play, receive attention, or simply break the current situation because it has associated staring directly at you with getting results in the past. Over time, dogs become extremely skilled at reading patterns in human responses, and if staring has ever led to positive outcomes, such as food, affection, or movement towards something enjoyable, that behavior becomes reinforced and repeated with increasing precision, almost like a silent negotiation happening through eye contact alone. What makes this particularly interesting is that many owners unknowingly train this behavior without realizing it, because even small reactions like looking back, speaking, or moving toward the dog after it stares can strengthen the association that eye contact is an effective way to control or redirect human attention. But even though this stare is more practical and goal-driven, it is still rooted in the same underlying intelligence and social awareness, because the dog is not randomly acting, it is actively communicating within a system it has learned works with you specifically. And once you recognize this pattern, the meaning of the stare becomes even more complex when we move into situations where it is not about bonding or requests, but about alertness, tension, or environmental awareness. There is another version of the dog stare that often gets misread in everyday life, and this one carries a very different emotional weight, because instead of calm connection or clear requests, what you are seeing here is a state of heightened awareness, where the dog is actively monitoring the environment and processing potential changes that might not yet be obvious to you. In these moments, the body language usually shifts in subtle but important ways, the muscles become slightly more rigid, the ears may orient forward or adjust repeatedly, and the eyes stay locked not just on you, but sometimes on a specific direction or stimulus that has triggered internal evaluation, even if that stimulus is not immediately visible or understandable from a human perspective. This kind of stare is deeply connected to survival-based instincts that still exist in domestic dogs, even though they live in safe environments, because their nervous system is still designed to detect patterns, movement, and anomalies that could signal opportunity, uncertainty, or potential threat. Sometimes this happens when a dog hears a distant sound, notices an unfamiliar movement, or senses a change in your own behavior, and instead of reacting immediately, it enters a kind of observational state where it waits, analyzes, and gathers more information before deciding what to do next. What often confuses owners is that this stare can look similar to calm affection from a distance, but the internal state behind it is completely different, because instead of emotional bonding or request-based communication, the dog is operating in a more alert and evaluative mode, where attention is focused on understanding the environment rather than interacting socially. And if this state continues for longer periods or becomes frequent without clear triggers, it can also be a subtle indicator of underlying stress or environmental sensitivity, which is why understanding context becomes essential before interpreting the behavior too quickly. Now, as we move forward, we need to address one of the most important parts of this behavior, which is the mistakes people commonly make when interpreting these stares, because misreading them can completely change how you respond to your dog in daily life. One of the biggest problems in understanding a dog's stare is not the behavior itself, but the way humans instinctively assign meaning to it based on emotion, intuition, or past experience, rather than context, body language, and learned behavioral patterns, which leads to interpretations that often feel right in the moment but are actually misleading when analyzed more carefully. A very common mistake is assuming that every direct eye contact is affection, because while emotional bonding can absolutely be part of that behavior, it is not the only possible explanation, and ignoring other signals like posture, muscle tension, and situational triggers can cause owners to overlook important messages their dog is trying to communicate. Another frequent misunderstanding is the idea that staring is always a form of dominance or challenge, a belief that comes from outdated behavioral theories that have been largely replaced by more modern research, which shows that most domestic dog interactions with humans are not based on dominance hierarchies, but on learned communication patterns, emotional association, and reinforcement history. There is also the opposite mistake, where owners completely dismiss staring as meaningless or random, especially when the dog is quiet and not displaying obvious excitement or stress, when in reality, even subtle eye contact can carry significant information about expectation, anticipation, or environmental awareness that only becomes visible when you start reading the full behavioral context. Another critical point is reinforcement without awareness, because every time a dog stares and receives a response, whether it is food, attention, movement, or even verbal reaction, that behavior becomes stronger, more precise, and more intentional over time, which means the dog is not just staring randomly, but actively learning how to communicate more effectively with its owner. And this is where understanding changes everything, because once you stop reacting automatically and start observing context, timing, and body language together, the stare stops being confusing and becomes a clear part of a larger communication system that your dog has been building with you all along. At this point, we are ready to bring everything together and understand what this behavior really reveals about the relationship between you and your dog, beyond individual moments and isolated interpretations. When you put all of these situations together, emotional bonding, attention-seeking behavior, and environmental vigilance, what becomes clear is that a dog's stare is never just one single message, but a flexible communication tool that changes meaning depending on context, experience, and emotional state in that exact moment. What looks like a simple act of eye contact is actually part of a much larger system of social interaction that dogs have developed through thousands of years of living alongside humans, where reading human behavior became just as important as responding to the environment itself, and where the eyes became one of the most efficient ways to exchange information without sound or movement. This is why trying to assign a single definition to the behavior always leads to confusion, because the same stare that represents affection in one situation can represent anticipation in another, and in a different context, it can simply be a form of alert observation with no emotional demand attached to it at all. The key difference is not in the stare itself, but in everything surrounding it: the body posture, the timing, the environment, and the learned patterns between you and your dog, all of which work together to form a complete message that cannot be understood by looking at only one element in isolation. And once you start seeing it this way, something changes in the way you interact with your dog, because instead of reacting automatically to behavior, you begin to observe it, interpret it, and respond in a way that matches the actual meaning behind it, which naturally improves communication, reduces misunderstanding, and strengthens the bond in a more stable and consistent way. In the end, that silent stare is not just about what your dog is looking at, it is about how your dog is experiencing the world through you as a reference point, and learning to read that correctly is what transforms confusion into understanding, and simple coexistence into real communication.